Today's headline is Yankee Sullivan, True History of the Fighter's Career. The subheadline says, How he met his death while in the hands of the vigilantes. Suicide theory discredited by one familiar with the man's nature. This article originally came from Portland, Maine, and was originally reported on May 4th. It says, Much has been said of late regarding the life and tragic death of the famous Yankee Sullivan. A gentleman of the city, an old Californian who knew Sullivan and was on the spot when he died, relates the following true story of the great fighter who met his death at the hands of the vigilantes. One of the Providence papers states that nobody knew his right name and that he went under various aliases. The only alias he was ever known by was Yankee Sullivan, and how he got that will be told further on. He was born in Cork, Ireland, and when but a young man got into trouble, and he was sentenced to penal servitude in Van Diemen's Land. Making his escape, he went to New York. His right name was Frank Ambrose. When he arrived in New York, he fell in with sporting men. He was a proficient boxer, and by the name of James Sullivan, soon became known all over the world. At the time when he was in his prime in New York, there was in England a man named Hammer Lane, the most noted boxer of his time. Sullivan went from New York to England, a most risky thing to do, and challenged any man of his weight to fight. That challenge was accepted by Hammer Lane. He met Yankee, and Sullivan defeated him. Sullivan's colors on that occasion were the American flag, and he was at once termed Yankee Sullivan, a cognomen which clung to him to the day of his death. There was present at that fight a man who was Sullivan's best friend, James Malloy, then an English pugilist. He was in the ring at the time Sullivan was in England. They were of about the same age and became fast friends. This corrects the statement that Yankee Sullivan went from Ireland to England to fight Lane. It also corrects the further statement that nobody knew the real name of Yankee Sullivan. Without referring to Sullivan's fights after his return, it is enough to say that on account of having been present at the desperate fight between Chris and Tom McCoy, terminating when McCoy left his corner and fell dead, game to the last, he was indicted. Joe Winrow, an old English fighter, whose name appeared 3 times in the life of Yankee Sullivan, escaped to California, while Sullivan went to the Sandwich Islands. Chris Lilly died a violent death at the time of the so-called Baker expedition. As for Yankee Sullivan, he was a great man in the sporting world at the Sandwich Islands, as he had been in New York. He opened a school and taught the king how to box. After some years, he wearied of this kind of life and went to California. He arrived at San Francisco about 1855. The Providence paper says that at that time, the Vigilance Committee was at the height of its power. As a matter of fact, there had been a Vigilance Committee in 1852, but there was none in 1855. The first bell was struck in May 1856. Sullivan was a boxer by profession and was known in San Francisco as a boxer. He had numerous challenges to fight, among the rest, one from old Joe Winrow, the English fighter. A match was made for $2,500, but the fight fell through. After Sullivan's death, Winrow said to me, I didn't think I could lick Yankee Sullivan, for I was older than he, but I felt like having a fight, and so I challenged him. Winrow trained Tom Hyer for his fight with Sullivan. While Yankee Sullivan's reputation as a fighter was known all over the world, not of course by the Vigilance Committee, yet at a time when almost every man and boy was known to go well armed, no man could say that he ever drew a knife or pistol, and the interference was that he never was armed. He depended solely on nature's weapons. Sullivan never had a street or barroom fight. He never ventured to hit a man, because at that time, if you struck a man in San Francisco, you had to draw as quickly as you could and defend yourself. Had Sullivan got into rows, he would have been killed at once. Now this brings me up to the time of the death of Yankee Sullivan and the exciting events which preceded his death. The following, which is going the rounds of the press, must at this time be corrected and the real facts stated. A story was recently published in Providence which stated that Yankee Sullivan, the famous old-time pugilist, was hanged by the Vigilance Committee of San Francisco, California, May 31st, 1856, because he acted as judge of an election in a bitter political contest, which resulted contrary to the desire of the committee. A gentleman writes to a New York paper contradicting the greater part of the story. He states that Sullivan was a rough and bully, and that he took possession of the polls, stuffed the ballot boxes, and elected one of his boon companions to the important office of county supervisor. The denunciation of the fraud resulted in the murder of James King of the San Francisco Bulletin, Sullivan being connected with the crime, although a man named Casey committed it. Casey and Sullivan, with others, were hanged by the Vigilance Committee, which was formed to avenge the murder and clear society of a gang of cutthroats. Casey was an editor of a paper. There was a war of words going on between him and James King Williams, who was editor of the Bulletin. They were calling each other thieves, pickpockets, liars, and the like, for an election was pending. King Williams went to New York and obtained a letter from the chief of police giving Casey's criminal record. This letter King Williams published in full in the Bulletin. The next morning, after reading the article, Casey left his office, probably with the deliberate purpose of killing King Williams, for on meeting him near the bank exchange, corner of Montgomery and Washington Streets, he shot him. No one was near the men at the time, but it was reported that Casey said to King Williams, "Defend yourself." They exchanged shots. King Williams fell and died a few hours after. Casey was immediately arrested and taken to the station house. From there, on account of the great excitement, he was removed to the Stone Jail in Washington Street and given in charge to Sheriff David Scannell, afterwards chief of the fire department. At the time Casey was brought to the jail, there was in the jail a man by the name of Charlie Core, who was arrested for murder. He was the husband of Belle Core. He had a possibility of getting free up to that time, but the killing of King Williams called the dormant vigilantes into life. Belle Core had spent thousands of dollars in an effort to save Charlie and had every prospect of success. A scene of wild excitement followed the arrest of Casey. Business was suspended, and in the midst of the tumult, the long silent bell of the vigilantes was heard, and those who were connected with the organization dropped all over work and hastened to headquarters for orders. Draymen unharnessed their horses and, mounting them, rode madly through the streets. They collected at headquarters, and a committee went to the county jail. There was a wicket in the door, leading from a platform, reached by a flight of steps, and Sheriff Scannell, standing inside, could see the men plainly. The committee demanded their persons of Casey and Charlie Core, and Scannell refused to comply with the demand. It was supposed from their after action that the committee reported to headquarters, for a gun was taken to the front of the jail on Broadway, loaded with grape and canister, with plenty of the same at hand. With the gun pointed at the door, Scannell was given his choice between giving them the prisoners and having the jail battered down. Scannell held out to the last, but finally, to save innocent lives, he yielded and gave up the prisoners Casey and Core. They were taken to the headquarters of the vigilantes, and there Casey and Core were hanged, not Casey and Yankee Sullivan. Then the vigilantes, not being satisfied with the execution of Casey and Core, arrested the following men, as I now recall their names: Charlie Duane, ex-chief engineer of the fire department, Billy Carr, Joe Winrod, Yankee Sullivan, and Billy Mulligan. These men were taken to the headquarters of the Vigilance Committee. A steamer was at that time due to leave San Francisco for New York, and Duane, Carr, and Mulligan were taken aboard with others whose names I do not now recall, and there confined until she sailed. They entered into a protest with the captain against being forced to leave, but their protest was of no avail, for the vigilantes stood watch over the steamer until she sailed. I now return to the two noted prisoners, Yankee Sullivan and Joe Winrod. The vigilantes let Winrod go, and years after, he died a natural death. Yankee Sullivan they kept at headquarters. There were at the time two stories told of the circumstances connected with the death of the great fighter. The story told by those who sympathized with the vigilantes was that Sullivan was told that he would be hanged the next day, and that the threat so worked upon his mind that he committed suicide with an old case knife, that the last report made by the guard was that he was soundly sleeping in his bed. In the morning, he was called, but made no response. Then they, for the first time, noticed blood on the floor and on his arm, which was hanging over the side of the bed. They immediately called the committee. They went in and found a pool of blood and an old case knife, supposed to be the weapon with which he committed suicide, and with which he had severed an artery. They argued that his knowledge of the human body was very minute, and that he knew just where to cut. Word was sent out through the city that Yankee Sullivan had committed suicide. The death of Sullivan aroused public sentiment against the vigilantes, and the Law and Order League was formed, resulting in the disappearance of the vigilantes themselves. In the city of San Francisco, Sullivan had many warm friends, and among them was this James Malloy, already spoken of in connection with the fight with Hammer Lane. On hearing of the death of Sullivan, his friend Malloy went to the headquarters of the vigilantes and demanded the body. After some trouble, the remains were given up to him, and Malloy took the body to his home, and 2 days after, there was a public funeral. As is well known, no one who has had a hand directly or indirectly in his own death can be interred in consecrated ground according to the rules of the Catholic Church, and the suicide theory was fully investigated by the Catholic bishop, who gave Malloy permission to bury the body of Sullivan in the Mission Dolores ground back at the old adobe church. The plot is about 3 miles from the City Hall of San Francisco. A tombstone was erected to his memory. The inscription states that the grave is that of Frank Ambrose, alias Yankee Sullivan, who died by the hand of the Vigilance Committee, and that it was erected by his friend, James Malloy. I have given the side of the vigilantes, as told by their friends at the time. Sullivan's whole career in fighting men proved him to have been one of the most gamey men who ever lived. Fear of death was not a part of the makeup of Yankee, and this fact was enough in itself to dispose of the report that he feared death by the hands of the vigilantes. This is the other side of the story of his death. I merely repeat what James Malloy told me years after. Malloy said that he understood that Sullivan died in this way. Being a noted fighting man, his guard, and passing in front of his cage, a temporary affair with iron gratings in front, far enough apart for a man to get his arm through, tantalized him by saying, "You be the fighter, eh? How much can you fight now? I can lick you myself. Come out here if you want to fight," etc. This enraged Sullivan, who, in order to get the guard up to the door, used the cunning for which he had been famed in the ring for coaxing a man up to him. The guard, suspecting nothing wrong, came up to the door of Sullivan's cell, when Sullivan, with a smile on his face, suddenly put his arm through the bars and struck the guard in the face. He had a sword in his hand, and before Sullivan could draw back his arm, struck him with it. The guard didn't know at the time that he had cut Sullivan severely, and Sullivan, on his part, disdaining to ask help of the vigilantes, and evidently not knowing that he had received a fatal wound, went to his bed, and of course became almost immediately unconscious and bled to death. In the morning, he made no reply when called, and he was found to be dead, as reported by the vigilantes, the wounded arm hanging over the side of the bed. This story came from the great state of Massachusetts, being reported in the Boston Sunday Globe of April 6, 1888. Thank you for joining us today. If you want to continue to uncover all of America's lost and forgotten history, then remember before you leave to hit the subscribe button, hit the notification bell, and remember to like and comment below. And we will see you next time on Americana Archives.